novelist Haruna Reiko is struggling with writer's block. Having won the prestigious Akutagawa Prize for Promising Cutting-Edge New Writers, which is an actual Japanese literary award, Reiko is having a hard time securing her voice in the publishing world. Working with her editor Kijima, Reiko has agreed to write a more commercially minded romance in order to boost sales and advance her literary stardom. Finding her small Tokyo apartment too confining, Reiko asks her editor Kijima to find her a spacious and cheap accommodation in the countryside so that she can likewise free her mind. Kijima follows through on this request with surprising alacrity, and Reiko moves into an expansive villa with little in the way of bounded space or formal infrastructure. In other words, the perfect space for imagination. It's not long, however, before Reiko discovers that she is not alone. Enigmatic Professor Yoshioka, an archaeologist seemingly straight out of a romance novel, takes up residence next door. Among other secrets, he harbors the body of a 1,000-year-old mummy, which soon becomes a point of connection between the two neighbors. In the relationship between writer and editor, scholar and subject, and neighbors sharing space, film director Kurosawa Kiyoshi explores the ways that the past haunts us in our connections to past and present, self and other, fantasy and desire. Professor Chika Kinoshita approaches Kurosawa's 2006 film Loft through the intersection of the mummy as metaphor, cinema as moving yet static medium of preservation, and gender as a disruptive force of intervention in critical analysis of J-horror cinema. In this video, as well as in her article on the film, Professor Kinoshita gives us a roadmap for the conventions of J-horror, noting that it is a discursive movement in addition to a genre. This perspective helps us to understand how Kurosawa's film Loft is both exemplary of, and in contradiction to, the movement of J-horror, so that we can see what lies beneath that which has been repressed. Hello, I'm Colleen Laird. It's my very great privilege today to speak with Professor Kinoshita Chika, Professor of Film Studies in the Graduate School of Human and Environmental Studies at Kyoto University. Her research interests are in Japanese film history, film culture, and gender and sexuality, particularly reproductive politics, and intermediality. Previously, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Film Studies at the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and has taught at the University of Iowa, the University of Michigan, Shizuoka University of Art and Culture, and Tokyo Metropolitan University before joining Kyoto University in 2016. Her essays have appeared in numerous journals and collections in both English and Japanese. Her 2016 book, Mizoguchi Kenji Ron, Eiga no Bigaku to Seijigaku, or Mizoguchi Kenji, Aesthetics and Politics of the Film Medium, from Hosei University Press, received the Ministry of Education's 67th Art Encouragement Award in the criticism of the first book category. She is currently completing a book manuscript titled A History of the Pregnancy Film that sheds light on complex relationships between film and visual culture, the cinematic body, and reproductive politics in Japan. In this video, we will be discussing Professor Kinoshita's 2009 essay entitled The Mummy Complex, Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Loft and J-horror, which appeared in the book Horror to the Extreme, edited by Jinhee Choi and Mitsuyo Wada Marciano. Professor Kinoshita, thank you very much for joining me online.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It's really great.
So I want to start out with a big picture question, which is to ask you, what drew you to writing about J-horror and specifically Kurosawa Kiyoshi?
I was much more interested in Kurosawa Kiyoshi than in J-horror when I first started writing about his films and also some J-horror films, because I wasn't a horror fan. I didn't grow up like watching horror movies. But I was part of this cinephilic film culture in Japan in the 1990s. Tokyo, I guess. So,
Mm.
and there, I grew interested in Kiyoshi, Kurosawa Kiyoshi's work. So, then I started my graduate study in the States at the University of Chicago in 1997. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the year, a big year for J-horror. But so I sort of left Japan when J-horror was becoming a big thing. However, almost every one of my friends, my senior five friends, was talking about Kurosawa Kiyoshi's Cure. And so I went back for New Year's holidays or something. Then
Mm.
in my first year in graduate study, I saw Cure in movie theater in Japan,
Wow.
and it really blew me out. It really knocked me off. So
Yeah.
that's how. And also, so however, when I first wrote a piece, an article on Kurosawa Kiyoshi in Japanese in 2004. Yeah, no,
Mm-hmm.
in 2003. I wasn't conscious of writing about horror films because most of his films at that time were horror films as genre films.
Mm.
However, I was more writing about an author, like a film director, Kiyoshi
Yeah.
Kurosawa. So, how so it's very interesting. Then Mitsuyo, the editor of the book you just introduced, Mitsuyo approached me asking me to write an essay as part of this J-horror collection. So then I thought, oh yeah, that's okay. Yeah, Ring is also a good film, so maybe I can do it.
Yeah.
And then that was when I was teaching in Canada at Western.
Mm-hmm.
Then um, I'm embarrassed. I was already in my 30s, and then I became a horror fan. No one would get, no one would become a horror fan in her 30s. And I had a child, and I was married, and I was in my 30s, and then I became a horror fan. So
That's
I started watching a
wonderful.
whole bunch of like movies, and also my colleague at Western who still teaches there, like Joe Bolters was a specialist in the 1950s American film. So and
Mm.
also he was a real horror fan at the same time. So he like gave me a lot of DVDs and a lot of tips and where I could start. And also, so that's how I got into this genre, and it was great. And then also, in order to write this piece, I reread um, a lot of essays, books
Mm.
Kurosawa Kiyoshi wrote together with
Yes.
his sort of friends or
Mm-hmm.
critics um, in Japanese. And because they were really hardcore horror fans, it actually gave me a lot of lessons. So I was like doing research on Kurosawa Kiyoshi, but at the same time, I was sort of learning horror films through his writing and also
Ah,
through like Joe, like my colleague.
yeah.
So it was really um, a valuable experience, and I'm so glad I actually became a horror fan in my 30s.
You came late to it, but it was the right timing
Yeah.
for it, right? I love that you came from this auteur perspective and then it was all happening while you were actually not in Japan, which I think is so
Mhm.
interesting, right? But despite that, being not a horror fan and coming to everything new, maybe it's because of your research that you in this essay, you give us this wonderfully clear definition of J-horror, what
Mhm.
J-horror is, and you put it in a specific historical context, which I
Mhm.
love. But more than just titles or a specific decade, you identify J-horror in your essay as a discursive movement that came about through the effective relationship with horror films, spectators, and fans, as well as the filmmakers themselves. So I'd like it if you could unpack for my students this relationship that came to be known as J-horror, and why is it a movement?
So I decided to use the concept of movement, or I decided to frame J-horror as a movement because of the ways in which I learned Kiyoshi Kurosawa's films and also horror films as a genre. As I said just now, I was reading a lot of the stuff Kurosawa, Kiyoshi, Takahashi Hiroshi, and other J-horror filmmakers wrote. And some of them were like round tables or conversations or some really good essays written by them in Japanese. So I realized, okay, they are really good critics, and also they are very sophisticated about even film theory or medium specificity, or they have very they are knowledgeable, they are so well versed in horror history. So it is not like just an expression of their experience, or it's not just like commercial project, but they wanted to put their understanding of horror history as an international or global genre history, and also aesthetics of medium specificity, meaning like the film, or especially the horror film, has to touch on what is film, or what film is, or what you can do with this medium. So I thought, okay, it is not just a group of films. So, and also they watch each other's films all the time and they discuss them. So I thought, and also fans are also very active, and sometimes they write. And it was before the Twitter age. So it was before that sphere emerged. However, still they wrote, and also, so there is this dynamic relationship between filmmakers, criticism, filmmakers' statements, and their practice of filmmaking, and fans and critics' reactions, responses to them. So it's not just a one-way street. So it's much more open to both sides. And so I thought, okay, this concept of movement rather than a genre, for example, would be interesting. And at the same time, my understanding of J-horror is pretty much in line with the standard understanding of J-horror in Japanese language criticism, I think. So I'm not making it up.
No, of course not. I love this because there's a tendency to think of J-horror as just marketing or just a genre. But yes, there was this whole discursive practice that was happening between the filmmakers themselves and the people who were producing these films. And I think I was surprised when I first discovered Kurosawa Kiyoshi too, that he's written so much on film. He's really very prolific in thinking about and writing about film. So I suspect that might be part of my answer or your answer to the next question. But we have these directors who are making what we think of now as J-horror film. What makes Kurosawa Kiyoshi stand out from this whole collective?
Historically, Kurosawa Kiyoshi is a little bit older than other filmmakers, such as Nakata Hideo, or Takashi Hiroshi, or like Miike Takashi. They were all born around 1960, so they belong to the same generation, and also they are the same as the first otaku generation
Yes.
in terms of age, like Anno Hideaki, and they are all about
Mhm.
the same age. So in that sense, he, for example, had experience in the 1980s filmmaking
Mm.
too. So he had, and for example, he also, yeah, worked as an assistant
Yes.
director with
Mhm.
some like the well-known directors in the Japanese film industry before he started making his own films. So there
Mm.
are some difference. However, I'm sorry, that's not what was I meant to say. Yeah, I think that's well, to
Mm.
me, Kurosawa Kiyoshi is interesting because he evolved he
Yes.
evolves, he changes so much. And
Mm.
also, even though we are talking about Kurosawa Kiyoshi as a J horror director, but at
Mm.
the same time, he ventures into so many other areas of filmmaking, other genres.
Mm.
So that is compared to say Nakata Hideo, I love his
Yeah.
sound. He is very talented, but for some reason, he only makes there are some like a couple of exceptions, but he is identified with the horror genre so much, so
Mhm.
kind of very strictly.
Mm.
So it may sound paradoxical to say this in a conversation about J horror,
Mm.
but because he does many other things,
Mm.
Kurosawa Kiyoshi does stand out
Mhm.
in this cohort of J-horror directors.
Even in terms of genre, in the film of Loft, I think we have
Mm.
a horror film, but also a romance, a romantic film in the
Yeah.
same way.
Mhm.
Maybe we have
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
So let's talk more about genre and aesthetics within this group
Mhm.
of J horror producers. So in your essay, you talk about the very much you talk about the aesthetics of J horror. So
Mhm.
can you share with us what you think some of those aesthetics are?
Okay.
Yeah.
First, it really concerns the borders, the boundaries between the
Mm,
visible and the invisible, or the
mm,
boundaries between humans and non-humans.
mm,
And um, for J horror filmmakers,
mm,
these two kind of boundaries were
mm,
really central to their
mm,
aesthetics. Aesthetics
mm,
because, for example, so in for example, in the film Loft,
mm, mm,
they showcase. I mean, um, Kurosawa Kiyoshi
mm,
showcases the ways in which a filmmaker can show a ghost or doesn't show a
mm,
ghost
mm,
in his portrayal of the woman in black. That's like a
mm.
ghost.
Yeah. Mhm.
So, so in that sense, so he does show her, but at the same time, you may have noticed how she is sort of like Sadako with long hair covering her face.
Yeah.
So you cannot see her face
Yes.
like that clearly. And also, she appears in
Mm,
woods or in the house,
mm,
or and then kind of she appears but then she disappears.
mhm.
And also, she is seen um, through the window, like sort of
Mm.
hanging out right there. So I don't know how, but
Yeah.
so that's how, for example, Takahashi Hiroshi, who was
Mm,
um, I think was the mastermind of J horror movement, wrote about um, the ways in which the filmmaker should like
mm,
represent a ghost. Like you
mhm.
can put her in a slightly unnatural, weird position or posture. And then even if you don't use any special effects or filtered photography, she might look very strange, and that's a very good way to portray a ghost. So that's sort of very fine-tuned, sophisticated. I'm not sure if the result is always sophisticated. I'm not sure about that. But as a discourse, it's a very sophisticated understanding of medium specificity. Because the central argument, I think I quoted him, Takashi Hiroshi, in my article, in my old article, but somewhere his the core of his argument is that you cannot tell a human being from a ghost if it's on film, or on TV, because it's on the image anyway. So you cannot tell a human being from a ghost. So that's kind of crossing the boundary or underlying the boundary between these two things is central to the J-horror aesthetics.
The medium of film itself, as you're saying, the people who have been captured on film are ghosts. You know, many of them are not with us anymore, and all we see are their phantasmal figures that haunt the screen in front of us. And I love the way that in your article you give this detail of here's how it should be done, right? These are the rules. Very systematic and thoughtful. But Kurosawa tends to sort of change that just a little bit, because she is wearing all black, so that feels very, very
rather than white.
So there's some departure that is happening there. Thank you for that. You also, in your article early on, talk about how J-horror, I think criticism is what you're talking about a little bit, where people are talking so much about J-horror at this time, but they're not really talking about gender, at least back then, right? They're sort of blind to that in some way. And yet gender is so much a part of all of these films, whether it's depictions of the female child or the housewife or the working woman, right? Gender is part of these films. So why, back when you were writing this, why do you think there was this blind spot to gender in the discourse? And do you think that's still the case?
My answer is very short, because all the J-horror filmmakers, writers were men.
There you go.
They were male. That's kind of my short and definitive answer. And also, it's changing. And I guess around the same time as I was writing my old essay, there are other women film scholars, critics, writing about J-horror, focusing on gender. And they are about in the same generation as me, like Washtani Hana, Ishida Minori, really brilliant women scholars. They started talking about gender in J-horror. So I hope it's changing. And definitively in English language, it has changed. I hope that's my sense. So so many things happened in the past 10 years. And most of them, I think, are positive. At least to me, in terms of gender, we started talking about it much more, and also it stopped being compartmentalized even in Japanese language film criticism and scholarship. So at the time, because the J-horror movement is very homosocial. I love their films, but there's no question. It's such a tightly knit homosocial film community. And yeah, and yet it started changing. Well, and Kurosawa Kiyoshi also started changing, I guess. I just wanted to add, like, the cinematographer for Loft is a woman, and she's been working with Kurosawa Kiyoshi over a decade. So, and you cannot think of any Kurosawa film without her.
Right.
And anywhere in the world, like a woman cinematographer is a rarity. So, and she is a master. Ashizawa Ashiko, somehow.
And I think that she's been involved in films that we've recently seen from him too, like I think Creepy. Was she the cinematographer?
Yeah, Creepy is her. Yeah.
Yeah, which really is about women's spaces as well, although you're going to talk about that in just a little second. My follow-up question was, you said many things have changed in the past 10 years that have sort of changed the dialogue. And I want to know what you think has changed in the past 10 years. What has contributed to that?
One women started, well, actually many women were working even in the 80s, 90s, and the first decade of this century. However, they became much more vocal, and also their voices started being heard more in the mainstream discourse on the media as well. And also, I realized younger generation of women don't really remain silent. They are very vocal, and that's a fantastic change.
Yeah.
And somehow, yeah, it's exciting. Finally, we are experiencing this real change.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I had a conversation earlier where we were talking about these terms, the lost decade and the bubble bursting and everything that is used to describe the 90s as so negative. Of course, because it disrupts this patriarchal order, but at the same time, it was a little freeing for some people as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, so, because like to me this goes on like the lost decade. Actually, it's not a decade. It's been lost forever.
Yes.
In Japan. However, well, like maybe it's a loss for some oji-san or some old men, old salarymen who had this like secure job and who earn enough to support the family, including a housewife and maybe 2 children. That kind of model was lost. And I'm so happy for that. I'm so happy. Yeah, it's gone.
Well, it's gone. We wouldn't have women directors and we wouldn't have young women speaking out if that hadn't happened, I don't think, right? So I'm glad to hear you say that. That was my thought. I'm glad to hear somebody else think that way too. So let me bring us back to the film a little bit, to Loft. And just to start out, do you have any favorite scenes from the film or scenes that you felt were really compelling about this film?
Yeah, when I first saw it, when it came out, I was by the ways in which Reiko, the heroine, was also depicted like a ghost. Like, when she, I think I mentioned it in my article as well, but when she visited the university facility, like next to her house, like she is shot through this frosted glass, and she places her hand onto the glass, and actually maybe it's a DVD, like a Blu-ray jacket or something. But that's how a ghost is depicted in many movies, especially in J-horror movies. But she is supposed to be the heroine, and she is not a ghost. And also, it was a beautiful image as well.
Yes,
So I
yes.
really liked that part. And but okay, I watched the film again last night, and then I noticed a lot of different things as well. Now I kind of like the women in black, the women, the ghost moves. Like she is is played by Adachi Yumi, who started out as a child star. But sometimes she had difficulties in adjusting her image to adult women roles. However, in this film, she's fabulous, and then the way she moves really questions sort of the boundary between inhuman and the ghost and human. So she did such a good job. But at the time, I wasn't struck by that this much. But this time, it really caught my attention. And finally, you sort of put this romance between quotation marks. And I think you did the right thing. I think that's the right attitude toward this like romance aspect of the film. But then now I came to really love this like scenes in the woods when they dig the shallow. The Professor Yoshioka and Reiko hang out, and then somehow mysteriously very strong wind is blowing.
Yes.
And that sort of makes the whole romance thing unnatural or supernatural, even though they were supposedly a natural mutual attraction. So I don't know. At that time, I think I thought maybe it's just a sort of like homage to the 1950s melodrama from Hollywood. But at the same time, this time I came to really like it. It was an interesting approach.
I love that you picked the two scenes that are also my favorite scenes.
Oh, great!
The when Reiko goes over and you get that shot of her through the glass and they're touching, and she looks ghostly, and then you realize on the reverse shot that she actually can't see him on the other side, right? There's ideas about boundaries and ghostly visions and panels and separations. I loved that scene, absolutely. And then the scene where the romance scene, maybe the first one, I thought of Hitchcock and those 1950s films where they're driving to the scene, there's that driving shot, and then there's the wind, and then the music swells with an orchestra that we've never heard before. And then it's just this moment of like, oh yes, of course, now we will fall in love and all will live happily ever after. But it's so unnatural. I think Kurosawa was doing something by showing us how unnatural it is. Well, I love that we love the same two scenes. Wonderful. So now I want to connect two things, which is Loft and the question of gender from before. So in your essay, you talk about how Loft questions the gender dichotomy of narrative and space, which exists in other writings, by destabilizing women's relationship with the everyday life. So how does this film Loft destabilize the everyday life?
I think it's helpful to compare Loft to to a subgenre of gothic horror, where a woman moves in a house, an apartment, and then she realizes her husband is trying to kill her, or maybe she is being threatened by a ghost or some being, or of the deceased wife of her husband or some kind of her predecessor. So, and this film, Loft, plays with that subgenre because Kurosawa Kiyoshi, in an interview, clearly cited an American film, 2000 American film, What Lies Beneath.
Look at this. Doesn't that look exactly like a face? And there's a hand, see?
Someone who's very close to me seems to be in contact with some kind of entity or spirit.
There's a ghost in my house.
Any idea what she wants?
She said... Did you know her?
I had an affair with her. She came out here to the house, threatened to kill herself.
Get out!
We can put this behind us. Our life can go on. It's not too late.
You had an affair with a girl who killed herself, and now she's trying to hurt you.
And you can find a lot of films like that. Probably the best, the most, like the Gaslight. It's basically the Gaslight genre, right? George Chika's Gaslight. And also Hitchcock's Rebecca. It's not like husband, but like Rebecca. And also in the horror genre, Rosemary's Baby is very similar in a way. She moves in an apartment and her husband is not trying to kill her, but he's trying to get her into this really weird cult or something. Thing. And so in these films, including What Lies Beneath, women is sort of stuck in a domestic space, in the house or an apartment. So most of the scenes usually take place within this house dwelling, and she is pretty much identified with that space. So she is this, usually then in these movies, she is a homemaker, housewife. She doesn't have so much role in the public sphere or outside of home. So she is very closely tied to the space of home. And so she does a lot of housework in 2000, What Lies Beneath as well. Like Michelle Pfeiffer is pretty much identified with that house. And so she does housework. And also there's this passivity. She is identified with space and she just waits for her husband. And she also passively suffers some threats from either the ghost or the husband. So she's really stuck in this space. And that kind of link between the space and the women is usually strengthened or even created by her sort of everyday domestic activities. On the other hand, however, if you look at Loft, she doesn't cook. She doesn't clean.
No.
The only thing she ever does is like smoke. She smokes like hell. And so, like most of the people, when they first see the movie, just vomiting this like black mud. But isn't she smoking too much?
She smokes so much. At the beginning, she has like 2 cigarettes that are still going, and then she lights another one, right?
So she smokes, and she drinks water, but she never ever cooks.
No.
It seems like a kitchen, as it's a very nicely decorated house, but she doesn't do that. And so even though she is living in that house, it is not this domestic space which tends to enclose women. So she's a writer, of course, and apparently very talented, like highly regarded figure in this fictional Japanese literary establishment. got this prize, but at the same time, maybe because of that, like she has no real like domestic life.
Yeah.
But I have to mention she doesn't shower either. Like in many like horror movies, like
That's
women
true.
take a shower,
That's
take a shower
true.
for no reason, but she doesn't even shower.
No. Even Michelle Pfeiffer is taking baths, right? As we know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's so true. So then this is a divergence from that being
Mhm.
trapped by space. And I guess we see that a lot, not just with her lack of domesticity or practices, but she's
Mhm.
constantly flowing in and out of that space too, which
Yeah.
is really interesting. In fact, it almost seems like it doesn't even have doors. Like everybody can come and go. And yeah.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. And it's
Mm.
very Kurosawa Kiyoshi in my theory because he, of course, like it's different in some more realistic films like Cure. It's probably very perverse to describe Cure as realistic, but at the same time, it kind of tries to recreate real Japan of 1997. You live in this like hardwood floor apartment with a wife, like who is like really stuck in that space. But in some earlier films, Kurosawa made for as a straight to video project, he also uses a lot of space there. Everyone can come and then go.
Yeah.
So that also deprives the space of some domesticity and enclosure, sense of enclosure, because of course, it's very threatening thing that the editor who put her in that house actually has the key to that house. Of course, it is. However, at the same time, so many people just coming, including ghosts.
Yeah.
And she just leaves, and then she also she's also trespassing into that university building next to her house. So in that sense, the boundaries between like a private space and outside is always it's really porous. It's always like there are so many holes and you can always cross that boundary. So in that sense, the women, I mean, Reiko is not a housewife. She's not even. She's an independent woman. She's a writer, but also she moves all the time in a way, even if she works at home.
Even from the very beginning, when she's in the apartment, I guess she's in Tokyo probably,
Yeah.
and she's smoking as she does. She's walking around the room. She's just so mobile all the time. She's very fluid, which is so interesting. She's not sedentary at all. And if I had to draw a map of that house from Loft, I don't think I could. I can't figure out what's the bedroom and how that's related to the kitchen and these spaces. They're just, like you say, they're porous. They're just ephemeral. It doesn't matter. You can just be in any of them at any time. So as you know, that this is something that happens in many of Kurosawa's films, this kind of fluidity of boundaries. But I'm wondering, is this film different from his other films in some ways, or is it part of his oeuvre? Is it part of his trajectory?
Then I really want to go back to the issues of the gender, because this is probably not the first film, because there were some more like J-horror-like genre films Kurosawa made before this film featured women as the main character, the protagonist. That happens. However, somehow this is the first film where Kurosawa took this really seriously. This is the first women, how to describe it? I wouldn't call it women's films at all.
No.
But somehow he really seriously tried to make a film about the women, make a film from a women's perspective. And then it ended up into kind of weird formats. First, even if she's like Reiko is supposed to be the heroine, the film introduces like dual perspectives in a way, because this Yoshioka also, so I think, becomes a protagonist, a main character in a way in the course of film, and so things started being sort of shot, not literally, but at least figuratively from Yoshioka's perspective in many ways. Just first, and then second, like, is Reiko a woman? Is kind of an interesting
What do you mean?
Because at that time, or maybe it's just, that's why I found it interesting. She is not, of course, she's a woman, and that makes so many aspects of the film much more, at least to me, interesting than a film about this like chain smoking male writer.
Right.
I think I would be much more. I still prefer chain smoking women writer than the one I just mentioned. But at the same time, yes, when it came out, Kurosawa gave several interviews, and some pointed out that there is this overlap between Kurosawa Kiyoshi himself and Reiko, because Kurosawa also like a chain smoker, and also this position within the sort of literary world or film world, like, and they were both. Kurosawa wasn't that young at the time, but he was this like rising star, and he's definitely talented. But how to adjust to more commercial environment was a challenge for him. So many actually pointed out that Reiko, who won this like really prestigious literary award, working to write a romance novel, is maybe really mirrors what Kurosawa Kiyoshi at that point was trying to do. So in that sense, in terms of gender, of course, Reiko is a woman, but at the same time, there is this clear overlap between the male director, Kurosawa Kiyoshi, and the heroine, Reiko. So in a way, the gender, it questions gender, the boundaries, gender, the categorization of domestic space, or under the public sphere, or women's identification with the space. But at the same time, does it really, for example, foreground women's issues or issues which tend to be associated with women's lives?
Right. So, very much you have, you have the
so
struggling artist. Yeah. The struggling artist who doesn't have to worry about, a parent calling them asking when they're going to get married, or if they're going to have children, or, if they're taking care of their health or what have you. And instead you have this struggling artist, who is just worried about being too commercial. And then, and then you have this film that gives you a fake romance, almost if Kurosawa is saying, fine, I'll give you a fake commercial film. That's not, that's not really a romance at all. Oh, that is so interesting. Thank you very much for that. I did not know about his interviews, but I can see now the juxtaposition of the male director onto the female character. So I want to get into the film, in the very heart of the film now, and talk about the mummy finally. So we have the mummy, which you've so clearly identified in the film as not just process of mummification of a body, but also film, which is also a process of mummification. And we have this immobile mummy for so much of the film until finally it's not mobile anymore. And this is about space and time. So big ideas. How does the mummy transgress space and time? How is it related to film? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the mummy.
One of the things that intrigued me first in this film was that footage of immobile mummy you just mentioned, because it's supposedly this like pre-war archaeological scholars like digged up the mummy probably, and then they found it on 16 millimeter, I guess, and then we can see the footage of time-lapse photography, time-lapse cinematography, but that's really interesting because it doesn't move. So it's a perplexing image.
Yeah.
So if it starts moving, that's a kind of standard treatment of that sort of sound footage. Or if it started the cussing or whatever, but it's just an immobile mummy. So I thought it's very sophisticated and interesting because it's a time-lapse cinematography. So between the times, then maybe it moved, but just the film medium didn't catch it. Or maybe just, so that nature of film, which is always sort of punctuated by the absence of the image itself, that's how we can see it on screen, right? And in a way, this immobile mummy plays with this foundation of film as made of 24 24 frames per second. But there is always a moment where there is no image.
And each one of those frames is static. Right?
Yes, static. So the mummy is static. But then at the same time, you see actually the mummy moving. That was also someone who was pretty much into the J-horror discourse, very moving, I think, because because it's a very blatant rendering of something supernatural. It's not just a trace, or it's not this figure in the photograph, or it's not some blurred image through a frosted glass. It's it's beautifully shot, but the mummy actually moves.
Oh, it does.
It does, and then so that was kind of, so within this J-horror discourse, clearly Kurosawa was testing the boundaries of the J-horror, the J-horror do's and don'ts, maybe, because you are not supposed to show the thing itself. But it clearly shows.
I didn't think of that, but now that I hear you say it, in that, I guess we can call it a montage of the 16 millimeter film, there's this slight change in perspective where we could think of that as the mummy moving, right? It's moving in space in some way, in a very passive way. Maybe it was moved. And then after that, we do have the scene in Yoshioka's car, where he parks it, the mummy's in the back, and he parks it
Mummy
on the
moves.
slant, and so that because of gravity, the mummy moves, but the mummy's still moving, right? And then later, of course, the mummy does move.
Yeah, actually moves.
Yeah. These are interesting stages of movement that I hadn't occurred to me until you just said that. That's fantastic. And it plays with our idea of what we should expect to see too in the medium as well. I love that. Thank you. Do you see other interpretations of what the mummy could mean in the film?
It's not my idea, but at some point when I gave a talk, or was I at a conference? Someone, I think a Yale graduate student or somebody, offered me a very interesting and compelling interpretation of the mummy, because the mummy is about 1,000 years old, right? So it's the time when women actually wrote, like the Lady Murasaki wrote Tales of Genji 1,000 years ago, and she wears that sort of like Julistoe and clothes like the women of the Heian court. So so maybe she was part of that culture. So this graduate student who I never met after that, I'm not in touch with, or I don't know, I just met. But that was a great interpretation, and that maybe it's about somehow it refers to the Lady Murasaki or women's writing in the Heian period. And so I think it's a great idea, and I wish Kurosawa Kiyoshi developed it in that direction a little bit, because in the film, why she mummified herself, or it is suggested that it was probably a form of suicide. She wanted to keep her beauty. That's why she like mud and then mummified herself. Possibly like sank herself into this like lake or swamp, but at the same time, maybe it would have been a little bit more interesting and compelling if she were a writer like Lady Murasaki. And so writing is one way to overcome death. And according to like film theorist Andre Bazin, I cited in my essay, and photography and the film was a means to overcome death. So in that way, Bazin is really weird. Bazin compared photography to mummy. But photography is an image, but the mummy is the body itself. So they are very, very different. However, however, clearly this women in the Heian period wanted to overcome death by mummifying herself. So if that's the case, maybe writing, she could have written something, and her writing would have overcome death and the passage of time. And that can be directly connected to Reiko and the Women in Black. Both are like women writers struggling, but in a very strange way. So plagiarism, the Black women, the aspiring writers writing, was about to be revived in a way through plagiarism by Reiko. So it's actually, I think Kurosawa Kiyoshi at the time really emphasized women's fear of losing youth and beauty by showing Reiko putting like lotion on her cheek and these like mirror shots. So, but isn't it more about writing? That's what I thought. Maybe then this issue can be was more interesting, especially in relation to the mommy. Wasn't she a writer? So
Yeah, I love this as an alternate reading so much, connecting this 1,000-year legacy of women authors, and we could have had a connection to Lady Rokujo and possession and
yeah, great.
put it in there. Missed opportunity, but I think there's an option for someone to do a spin-off now. I like that. That's wonderful. Do you have time for a couple more questions? Is it okay?
Yeah.
You do? Okay. All right. So also in your article, you talk about, again, the connection of time and space, but you refer to media horror. So this is an idea of media horror. So what is media horror, and how does it appear, within J horror, or Loft can be an example?
I first saw the term media horror through English language scholarly writing, like John Hill's, I guess, writing about the horror genre, but it generally features media such as film, video, or photography, or recordings. Those like technologically reproducible things, and somehow it's interestingly, even they deal with those like very modern mediums. They claim that this supernatural being is conveyed or propagated through these modern mediums. And so that's Ring is a quintessential example, right?
Yes.
It's all about the media, and it's all about the 90s medium.
Yep.
So this like cursed video is VHS. Sometimes these days I have to explain it to my students.
What is a VHS?
Yeah, VHS. Some of them are not that familiar with the old form medium. So VHS, and also TV. Sadako comes out of TV. And also ghost photography, spiritual photography is a thing which actually started this rumor about cursed videos among high school girls, high school students in the beginning of Ring, because supposedly, even if you cannot see a ghost or some supernatural influence by your naked eye, but photography can register it.
Yeah.
So, and some claim that our fear of this media environment, like some technologies, I would say, invading our lives, then this anxiety takes shape as media horrors, or media horror films are really good at like using that anxiety or so in the 1990s, that was, I think, video, like VHS and TV. But now, of course, and then Kurosawa Kiyoshi made a fantastic internet horror, a very early pioneering internet horror as Prof. And Prof, it's really fantastic because I guess it was possible only at that moment.
Yes.
I mean, the sound of the modem. Do you remember modem?
Yes, I do.
Because, maybe we need to explain it to the younger audience, but at the time, you have to connect to the phone line in order to get on the internet.
Yes.
Then it creates this really weird kind of like hissing noise. And that is very scary, and it's so effective in film. And Pulse takes advantage of this weird mechanical supernatural sound of the modem. So in that way, it could be only made at that moment.
Yeah.
Around the
Yeah.
turn of this century. And
Yeah.
then, so now, and J-horror, because as I said, Takahashi Hiroshi and others said that the film because it's all image, both ghosts and human beings might look the same on film or in photography. This is the specificity of the photographic medium. So from the start, there are a lot of use of visual photography and the media in J-horror. And also those were the early J-horror TV shows and straight-to-video projects were usually based on urban legends read by high school teenagers generally. Yeah. So, and in that sense, it had this sort of authenticity, really mediated authenticity in popular culture in a way. And and then I guess it became a global trend. I don't know if it is earlier because, for example, Cronenberg made Videodrome, and there were other like media type horror movies, or not necessarily horror, but the use of other medium like video was pretty prominent in international art film and in Hollywood films starting in the 1980s, I guess.
Yeah.
So there is a long history, but the use of this particular use of medium in horror genre was, I guess, developed by J-horror, and it became very mainstream. And for example, and of course, the Blair Witch Project was one of them. I guess it's not influenced by J-horror. It was made much earlier than J-horror, but at the same time, so it's not that J-horror is not a single origin, but things like a Paranormal Activity series, and those the use of media, media and media horror became such a mainstream and a popular subcategory of a global horror films.
Yeah, films that are so much tied to the very devices that they're being made on. So the Blair Witch Project is, all about the camera that's filmed. And the video era, the era of video and everything that gave us with experimenting with the media. And how terrifying all of that was back then. I don't know if it's still scary, but it was back then. So you've touched upon this global network. So I would like to also ask you, of course, J-horror became an international cult media phenomenon. What do you think was the appeal of J-horror outside of Japan? Because you were outside of Japan.
I was outside of Japan, so I should be able to tell you exactly what it is, but I cannot. And to some extent, because, to put flatly, those J-horror films were very interesting and really scary.
Yeah.
The first Ring, Nakata's Ring, was very scary.
Yes.
Kurosawa's Cure, which was more like art house thing than The Ring, I guess. But still, it is scary and a very successful film. So I think to me, J-horror became a phenomenon because filmmakers or the film itself really knows what horror genre was, and they were very well versed in the vocabulary, idioms of the genre, and then they can play with it and then change it and develop it. So it had a broad appeal in that sense. And also, it was about the media environment, which was pretty global. Everyone was watching VHS in the 1990s.
Yes.
Everyone was using the modem around the turn of the century. So it had this immediate global appeal. But at the same time, there is this exoticism as well. I don't deny that there is an allure of a foreign culture. So this is a very fun J-horror films. A fine mixture of these two things. Actually, three things. One, the global, like traditional horror. Two, global media environment. And three, exotic Japanese culture.
Thank you. I have one final question for you, which is so it's been a little while since you wrote this piece on Loft, and as you mentioned in our conversation earlier, you were saying that you'd sort of lost interest in horror, but now it's been recently rekindled. So, what are your thoughts on more recent horror films?
Yeah, it's still alive. J-horror is
alive.
It's still alive in many ways, even though it's changed a lot. Because, for example, Kurosawa Kiyoshi changed a lot. However, somehow it's still alive. I got interested in horror, actually J-horror and then horror movies in general, because I saw this Netflix series, June Origins. I'm not sure how popular it was in other networks, Netflix like regions, but it was talked about a lot in Japan this summer. It came out here in July, but it was directed. It was written by Takashi Hiroshi, as The Ring was, and then directed by Miyake Sho, who is this like rising art house director in independent cinema. And I read that Takashi Hiroshi and Issei. Issei also was resurrected somehow. He was the producer of almost every single J-horror movie in the 1990s and early 2000s, and he went bankrupt. So I thought, what would he be doing? And then he produced this Netflix series, Origins. So it's like The Ring, and it's June, but from a different perspective. And to me, and also it is a very self-reflexive series that traces the lost decade of Japan, starting. Actually, it starts in the 1980s, but it ends in 1995. That year, the Om and also the earthquake, the Korean earthquake. So, and it traces that year of Japan in which J-horror was nurtured. I think J-horror was like nurtured in many ways. So those horrible incidents, it was reported by the media all the time, and that created this environment where J-horror movies and then took advantage of that anxiety. So it's a very self-reflexive take on the period of J-horror in a way. And it was directed by a new talented young director, male director for that matter. But he's a very good one.
So the self-reflexivity is that we have this series that's come back, but it's not just Ju-on Origins, it's also the origins of J-horror too itself,
origins
right?
of J-horror in a way. Yeah. So that's how I got my interest in the horror actually was rekindled, and so I'm trying to write. I'm doing research on essay. It's part of my book, but an essay on the fetus of J horror. The fetus of horror, because a very weird fetus appears in June Origins. So I really want to talk about the fetus in J horror, but there are no but you don't remember any fetus in J horror because there are not so many fetuses. And however, so I think I would argue that how J horror really interested, which dealt with gender, domesticity, and family, how nevertheless bypassed the women's body as a real thing. So J horror depicted a lot of maternal love in a way, and also it even uses the womb as a metaphor. Some others have talked about that, but Dark Water is a good example. Nakata's Dark Water, or even Ring, the water is clearly that and then the baby-like thing is held by a maternal woman, but it's a metaphor. It's not a real women's body. So somehow women's experience of reproduction is strangely bypassed by J horror.
Thank you so much for visiting with me and answering all my questions and being so wonderful. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Actually, it gave me a great opportunity to revisit some of the thoughts I have, and also I realized I came up with some ideas while talking to you now.
Good.
So it's really, some of the things I said wasn't prepared. I just came up with it. So
it's wonderful. It's fantastic.
So thank you so much.